Good evening, and thank you for joining us here on Facebook Live. I'm Lindsey Pena. Many of you may have just finished watching the special that we aired on ABC 10 News called The Hidden Bias of Good People with Dr. Bryant T. Marks. Now, we're going to continue that conversation here on Facebook Live, where we have a little more time and a little more freedom to take answers and questions from you, the audience. We're going to continue that discussion with some of our local experts. They're here to help us understand how the way we see others can impact our behavior, and more importantly, what we can do to change that moving forward. I want to introduce my panel tonight, three individuals who have been gracious enough to join us. First is Dr. Stephen Jones of Jones, a firm that specializes in providing inclusion and organizational effectiveness. He's known as one of the nation's top experts on leadership, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Dr. Roxanne Kimani, life transformation strategist and owner of Kimani Catalyst Consulting, which is dedicated to creating a more just and equitable society. And rounding out our panel is Jordan Harrison, a professional speaker and educational consultant. Currently, he serves as the Vice President of Community Impact and Partnerships at Reality Changers. It's a nonprofit that helps young people pursue higher education. Thank you all for your time and being here tonight. We want to jump right into our first question, especially for those who might be joining us for the first time on Facebook and didn't have a chance to watch the special. We want to define what is implicit, hidden, or subconscious bias. Dr. Jones, this question first goes to you.
Sure. Unconscious or implicit bias is really that form of bias that is functioning beyond our consciousness, beyond our intentionality. And I think this is really important. Most people are familiar with conscious bias, and that oftentimes includes conversations about do you have a stereotype? Do you know how that stereotype is influencing the way you move, the way you interact? Unconscious bias is based on the neuroscience of the way the brain works, and it's really focused in on this idea that we've got this supercomputer processing 11 million bits of data called our brains, and we have the ability to consciously process 40 bits. You do the math. 11 million processing, 40 we're aware of. And that's part of why we say we can't test our unconscious biases against our intentions, because those biases are happening outside of our intentions.
Dr. Kimani, I'm going to let you jump in here and talk a little bit more about the science behind this in terms that I think anybody can understand.
Absolutely. I think to build off what Dr. Jones offered to us, the human brain, as he said, is just is capable of incredible things. And because of that, it also can be extremely flawed many times. And the science, the way that we think of it from the scientific perspective, is that we are making all kinds of mental mistakes through the data that we incorporate into our lives very quickly, very rapidly. And the cognitive bias can then affect our thinking and our actions. And the reality behind all of this is all of us have cognitive bias. Why? Because we are processing information, as Dr. Jones offered to us, so quickly, so rapidly, that we are creating shortcuts and creating habitual ways of responding to these shortcuts in order to process the information. And we are limiting our capacity to expand other ways of thinking and the potential for other ideas to exist. And we also have emotional and moral motivations in our thinking. We are also living in a very quick, rapid world with information at our fingertips that we can be completely overloaded. So again, we're processing so quickly and using data points as references that we typically go back to. And this is something that creates bias in every single one of us. It is not simply certain people or other people who might be considered prejudiced or racist or discriminatory. We all have biases. Why? Because it helps us to make decisions on a day-to-day basis. And sometimes those biases work in our favor when we're needing to make those quick responses. And then other times where it comes into the explicit or implicit bias is where we have the difficulties that we're talking about here today.
I think one of the things that Dr. Marks kept touching back upon is that, like you said, everybody has bias, but that if you live in society and you have a brain, you have bias.
Right.
And I also think it's important to note that this isn't always negative. It can be, in some ways, positive bias, that we aren't just talking about the negative bias that we have. Who wants to kind of jump in there for that?
Yeah, I would say that the idea of having a bias, for example, towards people who are open to receiving feedback, people who are self-initiators, people who are team players. So there are some examples and times of where those biases, as Dr. Kimani mentioned, helps us to make decisions that move us forward in a very productive way. I think the idea is when those biases, and I'll ask everyone to just think about, have you ever experienced a time where you met someone who reminded you of someone you did not like in the past? Right? And to think about how has that hijacked, right, your interactions with that person. And that's part of where those biases, with our best of intentions, can sometimes have an unintended negative impact and cause us to be more cautious towards some and more open towards others.
Dr. Jones, you had mentioned something about, when we're discussing bias, that basically we associate sameness with positive or good, and differences with bad or negative. Explain that a little bit.
Sure. It's the idea that part of the brain's job is to keep us safe. And so the brain pulls files, as we just gave an example, to help keep us safe. And so to the brain, to those 11 million bits, similarity equals safety. To the brain left unmanaged, difference equals potential threat. Left unmanaged, our brains will want us to coach and develop, give more space and grace for people that we view as similar to us. And then left unmanaged, our brains will stay neutral or go negative to people that we view as different from us. The key words in there is left unmanaged. Left unmanaged, our brains will move us in directions that it manages us as opposed to we managing it.
Jordan, I want to bring you in here because you do a lot of work with young people who are trying to get into college, trying to further their education. I guess, can you talk to us a little bit about how you see bias in action here in San Diego in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I think as Dr. Jones mentioned, when biases goes unchecked or unmanaged, we have young folks going into educational environments or different places being seen as something that they might not be seen as. For example, as we might have an overexposure of African Americans, maybe in athletes and media, in different types of roles, if a student tries to go into an AP class, they might be met with the teacher saying, aren't you more fit for the basketball team? Yeah. I remember having students that I personally work with where they're trying to have academic endeavors or feel like they want to succeed in an AP class or something else, and they might be met with someone saying, this class might not be for you, or aren't you more fit for the basketball court? And how that impacts the students that are saying, hey, I really want to go into STEM, I want to be a scientist or engineer, but they're met with the expectation that someone might say, in my cognitive schema, you're supposed to be somewhere else. And if they go unmanaged, it can impact the future and the possibilities for young folks in their development.
Dr. Kimani, I know you do a lot of work with businesses, individuals in trying to combat this. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you see? What are some of the experiences that you've had?
Absolutely. You know, I've spoken with a lot of different clients and organizations talking about how they see implicit bias or unconscious bias show up within the workplace. And part of the way that I approach this work is first trying to help people understand how they see themselves in relation to the world, where their identity connects to their cultural programming, and where their cultural programming is then connected to where their bias, where their thought processes, their values, their belief systems comes from. And because of that, then be distorted in our thinking. We can be influenced in our belief systems in a particular way that isn't just showing up in the workplace. So you see a lot of organizations out there doing a lot of the work, bringing in, people like myself or Dr. Jones or Mr. Harrison into these places. But it's important for people to remember that bias isn't just in the workplace. It is also at home. It's in our communities. It's in our families. It's in our friendship groups. And so the way that I try to help people understand that is to come from that individual perspective first, to be able to understand who they themselves are in relation to the different environments that they find themselves in. Now, talking about this within the workplace, helping people to understand where bias shows up. You look at the way that women are being looked at during the pandemic right now. We see, I think, over 160,000 women have lost their jobs or have had to leave their jobs because the automatic assumption, the unconscious bias assumption, is that women are the caretakers. They're going to be the ones that should and could stay home with the kids. They are typically the ones that would stay home if a child was sick. Those are all unconscious bias. Why? Because society has placed women in those roles automatically and assumed that if those kinds of things are happening, then the automatic expectation is for women to stay home. And so we're seeing that play out in the last year. And so one of the ways that I've been talking with different organizations about that is to pay attention to what is happening with all of their peoples. When it comes to women who are taking maternity leave, is there also an equal opportunity for men to be given paternity leave so that they can stay home as well? Because what we know is that both parents are needed and should have that same amount of bonding time at home. So that's just one aspect that I can think of. It also comes up in the decisions that are made in hiring practices. And so I've spoken to organizations about taking off the names on resumes, taking off the things that can locate a particular person. There is plenty of research, plenty of data that shows particular names, white sounding names, are more often given the positions than different names, ethnic names, or African American names, where there's an automatic or an unconscious bias that's associated to that name. We also see it in different education where people have gone to schools where previous positions that they may have had. We know that it comes up in age. So those are all these different kind of things that can come into play. And all of these biases show up in us unconsciously and implicitly. Sometimes they can be explicit, and we're so used to helping and trying to support people work through the explicit bias because it is the thing that we think that we can see that is the most apparent and available to us to work on, when in reality, the implicit bias, the unconscious one, is really what's keeping us stuck in this same struggle day in and day out.
I think a lot of people watching might wonder, okay, so if this is something that is out of my control, how do I figure out where my biases are? Where are they targeted at? What are some, exercises or ways that people can try to identify the issues?
Yeah. There is a scholar by the name of Dr. Erin Reeves who came up with this concept, an acronym. She calls it STUFF. STUFF. And she says one of the times that we want to watch out for biases is when we are stressed. The T is for when there are time constraints, when there's uncertainty, fear, and fatigue. She says those are the times that our brains will want to skip steps, as Dr. Kimani talked about earlier, right? And so this idea of paying attention to when the stress starts to increase, when the time, we're under tight deadlines, when there's a lot of uncertainty, we're afraid, or we're just tired. Those are times for us to pause and ask this question: which type of unconscious bias is influencing my actions? Not whether I think unconscious bias is influencing my actions, but which form of unconscious bias. Oftentimes the type of unconscious bias, I'm going to go back to that similarity. It's called similar to me bias, or in-group bias, or affinity group bias. And so, as Dr. Kimani mentioned, let's say I'm in an interview panel and, that person says they came from Louisiana, I'm from Louisiana. Oftentimes that feeling will be like, oh, I like them, right? So we have to watch out for What are those things that cause us to go, wait a minute, I kind of like this person? If that focus is not on the person's skills, but more about that person's background, that's an indicator that we're moving toward that similar to me bias.
Dr. Kimani, yesterday you had mentioned an online available test or quiz that people can actually take.
Absolutely. The Project Implicit, it's a research study through Harvard University that I adamantly encourage all people to take. It's a great way for people to connect, to see where they may have a tendency to lean in one particular direction or another particular direction, whether they prefer Black people over white people, if they prefer female over male, different ways of looking at where they might find themselves. And the interesting thing about that test, the way that they do that, is really taking you out of your head so that you start to make rapid thought processes. Because again, as Dr. Jones and Mr. Harrison were talking about, is that we are doing this so fast and so quickly. Again, because our brain is moving so fast. And when, as you just said, Dr. Jones, when we are out of time, we are quick. We are going back into our mind to just reach for data points, things that we have been socially constructed to believe to be facts, not necessarily truths. We think that they're the truth, and we then create them to be facts. And so Project Implicit, that test, you can Google it, you can find it. Thanks for bringing it up on that screen. But it's a great way for people out there to take a look and see where their bias is. Now, I've used this in my workshops, in my teaching at university, and I've had some people push back. I got the information and it says that I'm this, and I don't agree with that. It's hard information for people to take in. But as I said earlier, we all have bias. We all have it, and we use it every single day. And the implicit bias, when we're looking at having prejudice over one group over another, it's important information for us to be able to recognize within ourselves, because it is desperately impacting the relationships that we are having with one another, the way that we are communicating with one another, and the way that we are treating people, not just equally, but about the equitable ways that we are engaging with other people in our communities.
Jordan, I want to bring you back in here and talk a little bit about, Dr. Kimani is explaining how people can get uncomfortable and how this can be sort of eye-opening in a very negative way for some. Talk to me a little bit about how you deal with these emotions with your students, with people at universities that you might be working with, just in the education field in general, how you kind of combat sort of bringing this to people's attention if they might not like it.
Yeah, I think as Dr. Jones and Dr. Kimani both mentioned, first, normalizing that we all have biases and entering from a space of understanding that these are things that we all have to actively work to unlearn. It's something that we don't do for a day. You go to one 30-minute workshop and you're like, okay, I've addressed all my implicit biases. No, these things are actively coming into our lives every single day with what we're watching, who we're around, what we're consuming. They have real life impacts. And so I think I try and ground folks in, this isn't something to be like, you're a horrible person and you are doing horrible things. It's coming from a place of saying, if we can unlearn or just recognize on some of the mechanisms of our mind, we can show up and build a better equitable world. We can be better in our relationships, as Dr. Kimani was talking about. And it also can work in building better institutions, because we can't forget how we operate on the personal, interpersonal level goes up into how we design our institutions and how we build our society and our systems. And so if we can really start with ourselves of how we're thinking and build our friendship circles, our community spaces, our institutions, our environments like that, we can really build a more equitable and fair society.
Jordan, being in the education field, do you see sort of a shift in, people wanting to educate our children, being part of the curriculum eventually, that this is something that all children just start to learn about at a very young age?
Yeah, there's debate. There's some folks, I think, that are very interested in engaging in some of these. And I think for lack of information or for some ways fear of what this might mean for children, there might be some hesitation in it. But the honesty in it, and as Dr. Kimani and Dr. Jones have both alluded to, this is just connecting us to our core humanity. It's understanding what Desmond Tutu says, that our humanities are bound together. And if we could be more humane with each other, understand what mechanisms are working in our mind that might cause someone to be hurt or to feel pain, we can really build a better classroom, a better workplace, and everything else. And so I think recently, in the past year, there's been a lot more increase in interest in just understanding how can we be more sensitive. And it's really connected to how can we be more humane to each other and build a better humane society.
Yeah.
We're talking about the past year. We all know, in the wake of what happened with George Floyd and all of the other calls for racial justice and social justice, what have you all seen in terms of the shift, the fact that we're even having this conversation? Explain to me what you've seen just here locally in San Diego in terms of that awareness, that perhaps awakening, so to speak.
Yeah, I'll speak, Lindsay, to your question about, we are seeing K through 12 schools, we're seeing universities and community colleges, corporations, large and small, and nonprofits who are making commitments to addressing and dismantling systemic racism. But I think to your question, part of the shift is, in the past, I think people have looked more at interpersonal relationships. And part of what we're seeing now is many leaders, many organizations are saying this is more complex than we thought it was. We have to look at our systems in the recruiting process, our systems in who are we promoting, our systems in who are we developing. And we say that one of the ways that we recognize the impact and influence of implicit bias is by looking at patterns in our decision-making process. And when we have unintended patterns in our systems and the results of our systems, that's where we start to kind of raise the flag going, we might have bias at play. And I'll just give you a quick example. We were working with a group of leaders and we were talking about this in-group bias, similar to me bias. And two of the leaders, they were engineers, they looked at each other and we saw them, we said, what just happened? They said, well, actually the two of us were working on a job description this morning and we just realized that we pretty much described ourselves in the job description. And so they said, so we were about to put in practice a system where we were looking to hire a reflection of ourselves. So we say, if you look around and see a pattern of mini-me's, right, in your decisions, then there might be bias at play there. Yes.
Yeah. Dr. Kimani, your experience with this, because I know you work with, as you were saying, a lot of companies, corporations, things like that, in trying to address some of these issues.
Absolutely. I think, what you said about the awakening in it, it's a reckoning, and people have had to put a flashlight up to themselves and hold a mirror on some of their darkest places, darkest memories, and start to create some recognition and realization how they have colluded in systemic racism, how they have engaged in it and benefited from it. And that's not easy for a lot of people to hear, specifically white people who are now wanting to make that change and make that shift, but then not necessarily feeling like they know how to do it. I hear a lot from people who are afraid to take that next step for fear of getting it wrong or saying the wrong thing. And so the way that I try to support them in this is, one, allow people compassion, not only compassion for others, but compassion for themselves, that we are all going to get something wrong at some point. This work is hard, that yes, we all know that racism has been going on in this country for hundreds of years, but people are here, they are ready to be a part of the conversation, and it is difficult. There's oftentimes a lot of people who are doing a lot of reading. We see a lot of books that are coming out, participating in book clubs, watching webinars or seminars such as this, or participating in something through their work. They're also wanting to reach out to their Black, Indigenous, people of color friends, people in their community, to try to get some help in understanding what is going on. The reality is, people are awakening now, and we got to meet them where they're at and still hold them accountable to understanding what has been going on, that this didn't just start with George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery or Breonna Taylor, that this has been going on across this country, across this globe, and across San Diego for a really long time. And now collectively, we have to be willing to take that collective mirror and shine it up on the dark spots. And so part of the way that I try to help people understand this kind of thing is our unconscious is malleable. We can shift the way that we allow our bias to impact us. And some people go, well, it's implicit. How do we possibly do that if we don't know that we're doing it? It takes practice. It takes recognition that you have bias, that I have bias. It exists in me. And as Dr. Jones was saying earlier, is take that moment to pause, to reflect on how these decisions are being made, how the words that people are using are having a very serious impact on the person that they are speaking to. Develop the capacity to practice that reflection in the moment and to recognize that whether people want to own it, white privilege does exist, and it isn't just about using your privilege for good. It is about dismantling the system that allows white privilege to exist in the first place. It's about taking it apart and trying to support the collective and rebuilding it in a way where we are all conscious to the experience of equity and social justice for all.
Thank you, Dr. Kimani. To our other two panel members, what are some ways that you can suggest that people start to address their bias and start to change the way that they're living their daily lives?
Yeah, I'll start. And I think I'm just going to build off of what Dr. Kimani and Dr. Jones have both said. I think part of it is really that reflective process. One of the things I tell folks is you need to catch your second thought. And what I mean by that is the first thought is going to be your socialized thought. And your second thought needs to be your realized thought, which is like you taking the time to say, okay, this is what I want to jump to the conclusion for. Let me pause, see what's going on here, and see if there's some information I'm missing, a bias that might be informing this, and then develop that second thought. The challenge is this takes work. And this takes you not rushing to a conclusion like we would so quickly like to do, but really being more thorough and thoughtful for how we can show up for each other and for ourselves to really build that world that Dr. Kimani was speaking of.
Yeah, I'll build on that, Mr. Harrison, and I love that second thought concept. I really do, and I'm thinking about the idea that we have to make it psychologically safe and easy and low risk for people to give us feedback about our actions and interactions, our systems and our policies and practices, so on and so forth. And what I mean by that is it's this idea that the skill that it's important for us to practice is a skill called listening to understand versus listening to respond. We have to also manage both our intentions and the impact of our actions. And we have to be willing to admit mistakes and take ownership, as Dr. Kimani was talking about earlier, taking ownership for our actions. And so by lowering the level of risk, we increase the level of safety so that if, when, and where someone comes to any of us and says, I see a bias in your actions, we should thank them. We should thank them because they're helping us, because guess what? I can't see my unconscious bias. They're unconscious, but I can see yours and you can see mine. So we need each other in order to reduce the impact of unconscious bias. Psychological safety is a key part of creating that space on teams, in communities, and through interpersonal interactions.
I'd like to add to that too, if I may, Lindsey.
Yeah, go ahead.
In speaking to that psychological safety, oftentimes we hear the word safe space being used. We want to create a safe space. And, I would push that a bit further in considering that we want to create brave spaces. Not every space is going to be safe enough for everyone. We want to create spaces where people can be brave enough to speak up. They can speak their truths. They can call out when they see those biases in one another. The other thing that I think is important for, and this is speaking to people who talk about tone policing, specifically as a woman who identifies as multiracial, as a Black woman, I've been told that I'm angry, or I'm aggressive, or I'm abrasive when I'm speaking my mind, or I'm, calling attention to a particular thing. That's tone policing. And people might go, well, if you spoke in a softer tone or something, that's an implicit bias right there. That's an unconscious bias that is assuming Black women are angry or aggressive or abrasive when they are speaking with confidence. And so it's important for people to pay attention to even something as simple as that we have been in these conversations dealing with racism in a variety of different ways for so long, that when we are speaking our truth, it's, as Dr. Jones just said, it's about listening to somebody's experience and the words that they are telling you, not how they are telling you.
Understand. Guys, we have already blown through a half an hour, if you can believe that, which means we are just about out of time. But I do have some questions coming up. Or just some thoughts here, and I just want to kind of read them to you. It says, as a 68-year-old white woman, I just want to say thank you for this presentation. It gives me more to work on in my life. That's coming from Jean Wood. Thank you so much. Patty Thompson says, we tend to think bias or discrimination doesn't exist in San Diego, but that is incorrect. Right. The awareness or reckoning is reflective of the new mayor, the changes in county supervisors, which was so needed. So touching a little bit on our political leaders there. And one more from Golden Rose. This is true. Many people who have never been afraid of their words are now scared of offending someone of a different race. In my opinion, it's okay to not know. It's okay to say the wrong thing, so long as you are willing to make mistakes and learn from them. So thank you to all three of our panelists. We unfortunately are out of time, but once again, Dr. Jones, Dr. Kimani, and Jordan Harrison, really value all of your insights. And I mean, normally you guys all get paid for this. So this was all free and such great insight for those of us who were able to join us this evening. Although we are done here, ABC 10 News has an ongoing series called Stories for Change, where we delve into topics like this pretty much every week. You can find all of those on our homepage at 10news.com, and they're also on all of our streaming devices. So you have a Roku or a Fire Stick, you can just go to the section Stories for Change and watch some of the past stories that we've done. We profile San Diegans leading the charge and exposing the issues that still exist. For all of us here at ABC 10 News, thank you so much for taking part in this very eye-opening evening. I am Lindsey Pena. That is all for us on Facebook Live. Good night.
Let's sing our favorite song, 'cause it's been far too long coming. Your love, your love, your love, your love, your love. So won't you take my hand, 'cause I'm your biggest fan. We'll dance the night away, dance the night away. 'Cause I'm done waiting on a better day, 'cause everything's gonna be okay, 'cause I've got your love. Don't ever let go. I feel at home.